recording.
Now, I do have a cat in the room, so I'm hoping he will be quiet.
Okay, so I will go ahead and begin. Okay, so good day. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Philip Hansten in the series that I'm calling Reflections from Pharmacy Leaders Advancing the Profession. So, and Dr. Hansten is a professor emeritus from the University of Washington in Seattle. And I have known, not personally, although I may have attended some of his continuing education programs years ago, but I remember him in the 70s, because that's when I began my journey in this profession. He published his first drug interaction book in 1971. And it sold over 1 million copies and translated into numerous languages. And I have to say, the pharmacy school I was at the time, they required us to purchase that book, which is interesting.
Great.
I should have kept the first issue, but I did, because I tend not to keep books. I tend to give them away, but that's okay. And he's still very active in the world of drug interactions. And on another note, he is a founding member of the American College of Clinical Pharmacy, one of the 29 founding fathers of that organization. And what I'm probably more intrigued by is his current work in the field of philosophy. I believe he's currently teaching at UCSF about the philosophy of science. And he's the author of at least 3 philosophy books, including the first one that I'm familiar with, Premature Evacuation, the Ignorance of Certainty, and the Ghost of Montaigne. And that's the book that I first came across that it was outside of drug interactions for authorship by Phil. And that got me really intrigued, because I think that's the aspect that I'm probably more intrigued by, than, although I am intrigued by obviously your work in drug interactions. So we'll go ahead and begin. I'll stop sharing the screen and turn it over to my first question, which is, we want to learn more about your journey. Now, what I'm doing these interviews for is really to teach people about the history of the transformation of our profession and to gain insights into the leaders behind that transformation. So, so this is a real honor to be able to interview you. So maybe share with us, we would like to learn about your journey into your development in terms of your area that you became recognized as a leader in. And you may want to include key events or key people who influence you in that journey. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for doing this interview. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And actually, I would like to start. I don't know if people normally start in high school, but I'm going to start. I'm going to start in high school.
Yeah, and some people do. They start when they were born.
Right. Well, it doesn't go back that far, but I was in high school, and I hate to admit this, and I know it's being recorded, but I'm going to admit it anyway, that I was fascinated by science, and I was getting A's in all my science classes, but all the other classes I let slide. And so I just figured that the science was so interesting that I had to focus on that. Now it's interesting now that I'm doing so much philosophy, but and so I was working in the summers at hard manual labor. I was just exhausted. I would come home from working out in the orchards, and all I could do was eat and go to bed and get up the next morning. It was just terrible. And one day, I remember this day exactly. One day, and I need to turn off my phone just in case.
Me too.
I was sitting there at lunch with a couple of my coworkers, and one of these guys sort of gave me a little lecture about I better not, about what it was like to, because he did this for a living and had for decades, and what it was like to, with no education, what it was like. And so a light bulb turned in my mind. I better start studying not just science, but the other classes, because I wasn't going to go anywhere, with that kind of mismatch. So it really did change the way I focused on. So even the classes I wasn't interested in, I still had to study those. So then from then on, I was a good student from then on. And then so I got into pharmacy school because I managed to get my grades up so I could get into pharmacy school. And a pharmacy professor by the name of Bob Miller stopped me in the hallway one day, and I was a pharmacy resident at this time, almost done. And he said, "I've got something for you." And he gave me, and I still have it. This was in 1966.
Oh, wow.
I still have it. This was an article, and it was a pretty thick, I don't know how many pages there, but
Oh, wow.
probably 40 or 50 pages. This was the very first symposium on drug interactions. Before this symposium came out, and it was the Royal Society of Medicine Symposium, Clinical Effects of Interactions Between Drugs. And before this, it came out, it was published in November of 1965. Before this time, there were nobody paid any attention to drug interactions. I never even heard about the topic. I kind of vaguely knew that it might happen. So thank goodness he picked me to give this. So we went to he had a copy, we went to the Xerox room. He said, "Follow me." We went to the Xerox room. He made a copy for me. And I still have all my underlinings and comments
Wow.
from 1965. And so I was just fascinated by this. I thought, wow, this is something pharmacy could get involved in. The pharmacist then could look at the drugs the patient is getting and advise the physician, advise the patient, and do that sort of thing. But then the most important person in this was a medical professor. So I started working on this, and I was making tables of these interactions, and I was working in the Drug Information Center down in the, it was right in the hospital, it was in the library. And we had physicians come down to ask questions periodically. One of them came down, asked me about, and I still remember this, I don't know why, but carbamazepine. And so I didn't know the answer, but I found some information for him. And he said, "What are you working on there?" Because he saw all these charts and stuff. And I said, "Well, it's on drug interactions." And he said, "There aren't any books on that. You ought to try to write a book on that." And he gave me the name of a publisher, Lang Medical Publications, which was not far away. And it was run by a physician, Dr. Lang. And so I got it all together. I spent a month getting it ready. I got it all together. I took it down to Lang Medical Publications, and my cat is trying to interfere with us here. And they were very nice when they turned me down. They spent an hour with me. They said, "Well, no, we're not really interested," but and they gave me advice on what to do about it. So I don't take rejection well, so I just dropped this topic. But then I saw that same physician who had encouraged me originally in front of the hospital, and he recognized me. He said, "Aren't you that pharmacy student that was working on drug interactions?" And I said, "Yeah, I took it down and they weren't interested." And he said, "Well, you got to keep working on this." And he started bringing me articles on drug interactions. And even after I went to work at a drug information center over in Berkeley, across the bay, because I was in San Francisco at the time, he found me and he started bringing me articles over there. He was just relentless. So finally I sent it to Lee and Febiger, a publisher in those days, and they accepted it. And it totally transformed my career, completely transformed it. So that's the good part of the story. The embarrassing part of the story is a couple of years later, after the book came out, I was up at Washington State University teaching at the pharmacy school up there. And I was talking to my old boss back in Berkeley, and I said, he said, "Hey, you know that guy you dedicated your book to?" Because I had put a big thing in the book about it. And I said, "Yeah." I said, "How's he doing?" And he said, "Well, not very well. He was arrested." And I said, "Arrested for what?" And he said, "For impersonating a physician." This is a true story. So,
Wow.
and he was arrested. He was going around the hospital examining people and doing all sorts of terrible things. And I had dedicated my first drug interaction book to him. So anyway, rather embarrassing story about how this all came about. Then the philosophy stuff actually came from, and this is the last point, from a professor at the University of Texas. He's since died, unfortunately, Robert Solomon, who was a philosophy professor. In fact, this is one of his books that I have, The Joy of Philosophy.
Oh, wow. Okay, great.
But I listened to a series of tapes that he had on, he and his wife, who was also a professor, on Friedrich Nietzsche. And I ended up starting to read, thank goodness the first book I read was this one right here, which is, where is it? Well, anyway, here it is, Human All Too Human, which is a lot of discussion about human foibles and how we come up with ideas that are often wrong, and that kind of thing. And then I proceeded to read the rest of Nietzsche. This whole shelf is all Nietzsche. And then after reading those, I read pretty much all the other major philosophers. So I really became addicted to philosophy at that point. So that's how the philosophy part started about 35 years ago.
Wow, that's neat. So one of the questions I also ask is, and you have a legacy because you are in the history books, but reflecting on your legacy in 20 years, you have a legacy now, but maybe reflect on, the way I paraphrase this is reflect on the contributions you feel you're most proud of that really has helped advance the profession.
Well, if you'd asked me that question 15 years ago, I would have said, well, I think I've advanced the field of drug interactions, and especially with regard to the thing that we started off early on focusing on was the management of drug interactions. Because there's a lot of information out there on what drugs interact and how they interact and what the mechanism is and what's the magnitude of the interaction effect and all of those kinds of things. And now we even have epidemiological studies saying how often it causes problems. But all of that is great and necessary, but we also need management. We need to know what are the options that, if you have a person who is going to get these two drugs, what are the options? What are the ways we can handle it? Should we use a different non-interacting drug? Should we monitor the patient? Should we just give the patient advice on how to separate the doses? Or, there's 10 or 15 different kinds of advice that you might use in order to manage or get around the likelihood or reduce the likelihood that they will be adversely affected. So that's, from a drug interaction standpoint, I think that's the main thing that I think we have advanced. But from a philosophical standpoint, it's when I started teaching philosophy of science to pharmacy students about 15 years ago, I had no idea. And this was philosophy of drug interaction, so sort of scientific philosophy, but also a philosophy of how to live your life. Most of it was scientifically directed, but there's also a lot in there that is helpful in how to construct your life, a life that is a little bit better than it would be without it. So, but I started getting emails from students after, and I never got these before ever. I mean, I think I gave good lectures on drug interactions, but I never got these kinds of emails until 15 years ago, where people would send me emails, sometimes 2 or 3 years after they took the class, explaining how it had an impact on them. And it's not me that did it. It was me telling them what the philosophers had to say.
Right.
So I didn't take personal credit for it. All I was doing was introducing them to the ideas from all of these philosophers. And so they were really complimenting the philosophers, not so much me. But it was really gratifying, and to have pharmacy students say, some of them asked me for recommendations on which philosophers in a certain area, and so I would give them. And it wasn't all the students. Not all students are into philosophy, but it was a large enough group of them that really enjoyed it. So that's where I think my current legacy is.
Yeah, absolutely. So advice for students in their professional journey, especially as we look at, hopefully they'll develop as leaders, a little L, and they could be big L's, but little L's, people who will obviously influence people's change to make changes to advance the profession. Right.
Well, the first one relates to the philosophical stuff, and I think that's to use both sides of your brain. And I'm a perfect example of that. In high school, I just loved science. I thought it had to be scientific or else it wasn't even worth considering. And I do, over the years, I've been teaching pharmacy students a long time, as have you. And some of them are so left-brained and so focused on just the deep scientific details that they forget the other part. And I know you personally have a big interest in that, in having pharmacy students. And I support your what you said about that, because I think, and I've read some of your articles about how pharmacy students need to have that. And,
right, the preferred humanities.
The other part is to revere objectivity. if you just think objectivity is nice, then that's fine, but you're probably going to fall way short. You really have to love being objective, and revere, I think, is not too strong a word.
Mm-hmm.
We're all going to fall short of objectivity, but you really need to think about when you're dealing with any kind of an issue, especially a scientific issue, but any other issue, try to be absolutely as objective as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you have to have that be one of your goals. Objectivity has to be one of your goals.
Mm-hmm.
The other one that is really useful in your profession and your personal life is to tolerate ambiguity. There's an awful lot of stuff out there in the world that's ambiguous. A lot of drug interactions are ambiguous. And it's those ambiguous drug interactions that we're not really sure exactly. We know that they're potentially really serious, but we're not exactly sure how often it happens, or there are certain aspects of the interaction we don't know about. So it's a bit ambiguous. This is when philosophy can help. Philosophy can help sort out some of these ambiguities and say, okay, given what you're telling me about the ambiguity, here's a philosophical way to look at that may come to a better solution. So I think that we have the scientific part. Some drug interactions are slam dunks. You don't need philosophy for those. But you don't need it at all. But many of them aren't. And for them to have the scientific evidence and then the philosophical evidence to add to that. Don't be afraid to fail. This is so trite that I hate to say it because people have heard this a million times, but it's no less true for being trite. You know, sometimes trite things are really true and need to be, you have to be willing to fail. You have to take chances. And I don't mean, hang gliding.
Reckless.
Not reckless.
Reckless.
But you need to be able to say, okay, here's an idea about how to handle something in my job that might be useful, and to try it out on people, and not to say, oh, well, maybe it won't work. I mean, try it, see if it works. If it doesn't, fine.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing, especially with regard to leaders, small L or big L leaders. And actually, President Eisenhower has a great quote. I can't quote it directly, but I agree with him completely on this. There are many factors that are very valuable for a leader, whether you're leading just a small group or a larger group. And some of these can be learned, and you can read books about it, and all of that stuff is great and valuable. But the one indispensable thing is integrity. All of that other stuff is wonderful. And this applies not, of course, to non-leaders as well, but if you're a leader, if you don't have integrity, forget all the rest of it, because you're not going to be effective in the long run. You'll be effective in the short run. You may, go up the ladder a bit, but in the long run, when your life is over, if you haven't had integrity, then it's really not worth it. So integrity is the key. And the Eisenhower quote, President Eisenhower quote, he goes through, he says, it doesn't matter if you're in the Army or if you're a football coach, or if he goes through all this list of all these kinds of people. He says, it doesn't matter what you're doing. Integrity is number one. And so I would agree with Eisenhower on that.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for those remarks and advice. And the last question I have, we're living in interesting times. And as I, teaching a history, I'm teaching about the last 150 years of the profession and tracing how we advanced to more of a patient-centered profession. As we study the decade of the 2020s in 10 years from now, we will look at one of the highlights or turning points, I believe, in the 2020s for us as a profession will be the COVID-19. So, I believe it's obviously going to create opportunities for the profession, but it'll be one of those things, a significant turning point, like other things that have happened in history have been turning points to help advance our profession. So comment on that. How do you see that really becoming a turning point for us as a profession?
Well, I think that especially now, but I think it will continue on with time, and that pharmacists need to be at the forefront of helping people sort out all these drug trials that are being done. There are a lot of them being done that we really wouldn't even call a drug trial. I mean, they're just gathering a few people together and giving them some drugs, and so we have to be a voice of reason in what constitutes a valid drug trial and what does not. And I think many of the students would clearly understand that the general public doesn't understand this. I mean, they really don't understand why randomization is important, or why having a placebo is important, or some other therapy to compare is important, and numbers of patients is important. I mean, and there's no reason for them to understand that stuff, but pharmacists then could really be helpful, both as in organizations where they would give official information about that, but also just in your dealings with patients. So if a patient comes in and says, well, what about hydroxychloroquine? I think I need to be on that, or whatever. Then you could kind of explain, well, here's, and that's a moving target.
Right.
Today, here is the situation with that. And I'm working on a grant with a number of universities where we're trying to, a drug interaction grant. Dan Malone at the University of Utah is the main person. But, and one of the things we're looking at, we're going to do a webinar, and we're looking at maybe talking about the drug interactions of some of these drugs. And we realize that we're thinking about doing that in a month. A month from now, the drugs we're looking at now may all be, have been eliminated as even possibilities. But certainly, if there do turn out to be drugs, especially like antiviral drugs that are useful in treatment of this, many antiviral drugs do have, depending on which type, a number of drug interactions. So pharmacists would clearly be at the forefront of monitoring for that.
Exactly.
So those are just a couple of areas where I think that we have opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, I appreciate these comments. I think this will be very helpful and insightful for our students. And it's really an honor to, in the flesh, to hear a voice of someone in our history books in terms of a legacy, in terms of drug interactions. And of course, the philosophy part, most of our students aren't aware of that, but that's great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It was my honor to participate.
Yeah, and let me stop the recording.